Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be talking about European imperialism and popular resistance. Still sticking to the 19th century where we've been kind of hanging out for a little bit, trying to get a handle on this long sort of 100 years plus or minus that really sort of shaped a lot of the world we know today. This long 19th century sees all kinds of things happening, the formation of nation states, more revolutions, the rise of communism, all kinds of stuff is starting. But this time we're going to look at imperialism in the sort of form that we know it in modern version, particularly coming out of Europe, the United States, and Japan. We'll see a sort of growing imperial presence around the world, sort of culminating in basically every country having some sort of colonial history. In Africa and Asia, there's a few exceptions, which we'll get to kind of along the way, but for the most part, we're going to see the entire world is colonized during this period. So when I say most of the world was colonized, what does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? We'll talk about some of the foundations of empire, what enabled Europeans and Americans and Japan to uh, impinge on their neighbors. We'll look at the sort of expansion of imperialism, where it traveled, what it was for, and we'll look at the development of a colonial world. What did the world start to feel like for people outside of Europe, outside of the United States? There was a new character to life, a new character to society that is going to drag on for quite a while, certainly through the end of World War II in the 1950s and 60s. And a lot of unexpected developments come out of colonization. So during this long 19th century, we get a new form of imperialism. This is something that's uniquely modern. It's not part of previous history. Of course, there had been empires before, there had been colonization for a long time. If you've taken the first half of world history, if you've taken some sort of ancient history, right, the Greeks had colonies all around the Mediterranean, the Chinese colonized their neighbors, stuff like this. But something sort of new is happening here. It's enabled by industrialization, it's enabled by new ways of thinking, and the sort of modern process itself. So what does imperialism mean? Well, it's actually a surprisingly new term. It only really dates from about the mid 1800s. Before this, people talked about it quite differently. You might talk about having colonies or the state expanding or something, but imperialism itself is a pretty specific idea. It only became a popular idea to talk about by about 1880. Before that, most people would have never heard the term. At first, it's describing military actions. So the military would be an imperial force, or you might talk about the sort of imperialistic nature of the British Army, or the British Army enforcing a sort of imperial world. But later, it starts to transition into a cultural and economic term. So you can talk about cultural imperialism, economic imperialism. What does all that stuff mean? It's pretty expansive and sort of covers a lot of ground that we'll get to. But there were a lot of different motivations for this sort of expansion. When you think about imperialism, you probably think about one country taking over another country that's sort of far away to exploit their resources or control them in some sort of manner. And that's true. There are sort of military and economic reasons to do that. There's also a lot of political motivations. If you're a relatively new nation state, you might want to try and get some colonies further afield so that you can have more resources, you can have more money, more prestige. There was also a sort of religious element. A lot of imperialism comes through the work of missionaries. In particular, the United States sends a lot of missionaries into the Pacific and into East Asia. There's a lot of internal problems that can be solved by imperialism. For example, the French government always had, something different going on. They have several different governments over 100 years or so. But one thing they could kind of always rally behind was the colonies. It could always be seen as a sort of pressure valve. If there's too many problems going on inside the state, you just flip it and you say there's some problem out in the colony that needs to be addressed. There was also a certain sense of nationalism and pride involved here. This idea that, my country is so great then I need to go take over this uncivilized, backwards place and make it great too. That's not normally what happened, but that was often a sort of explanation for imperialism and for why people went overseas. Here you have a very famous imperialist in this image. This is Rhodes from Britain, sort of stretched all across Africa, right? And the idea was he was bringing, great civilization, and the British would bring development and sort of modern life to the African folks that were there. Of course, the British didn't really intend to do any of that, as we'll see. In order for the sort of modern form of imperialism and modern forms of empire, you needed all of the new industrial process. You needed all of these new sort of tools of empire. What the British or the United States or the Japanese were up to wouldn't have really been possible earlier without all of these sort of technological and industrial developments. So you might look at medicine, for example. Well, actually, Europeans had had a pretty difficult time moving inland in Africa or South America. For example, we looked at with the slave trade, right? The Portuguese would deal with traders on the coast because if they tried to go inland too much, they simply died from disease, in large part, but also from hostile forces trying to repel them. But with medical advances, Europeans started to get a leg up. One of the things they discovered in South America in the 1820s was quinine. It's derived from a bark that local folks were using as a medicinal herb. The British noticed that when you ingest quinine, either as a treatment or as a prophylactic sort of preventative, you don't get malaria, or it at least prevents a lot of the damage from malaria. Also, vaccines were being developed. So Europeans were able to travel farther in places that were unfamiliar to them with less medical concerns, even sometimes than local folks. So that had a huge impact on their ability to survive in those environments and thus manage or govern there rather than just do it through military force alone. Another thing that we see a massive development that enables this sort of empire, these sorts of imperial practices, are steam power. All kinds of new travel possibilities come from railroads, come from steamships, whereas before your empire had to be sort of carefully managed in the long run. When it takes 6 weeks for the Spanish to send a ship to Mexico, there's a certain amount of communication that can go on, and you have to sort of trust the governors in Mexico to do what the Spanish want. But once you have steam power, you can go back and forth really quickly. You can take soldiers back and forth really quickly. You can take communications back and forth really quickly. Also, these travel possibilities allow for the extraction to be more unilateral. So, for example, we're going to see the British build a lot of railroads in Africa, where the French build a lot of railroads in Vietnam. But they don't do that so that Vietnamese people can move around a lot, or they don't do that so, Kinshasa can be more connected to the world. They do that so that they can pull resources out more quickly. Those railroad lines go to mines, they go to the edge of forests, where there are products being extracted that Europeans want. So that sort of steam power allows for a lot more of that. Likewise, we see military machinery becoming more and more sophisticated, making it easier and easier to kill people more rapidly. This, of course, is going to help with colonization and imperialism in that if one side has these sort of industrialized tools of death, as it were, and the other side doesn't, it makes it basically impossible to defend yourself. So in the 1850s, we start to see rifling and guns. That's if you're hip to guns on a rifle, inside there's sort of an etching pattern that makes the bullet spin when it comes out. If you like football, for example, the quarterback always throws the ball with a nice tight spiral, right? That's to make sure it goes the furthest and most accurately. It's the same thing with a bullet. So before, when you're shooting like a musket ball out of a rifle, it wasn't really all that accurate. There were a lot of imperfections that could cause that ball to kind of go all over. But when you shoot a bullet out of a nice spiraled round, it tends to go more where you want it. Then, by the late 1800s, you start to get the introduction of machine guns. Here's a nice illustration of a machine gun in action. The Maxim machine gun allows for nations that have adopted its use to essentially just mow down other people who haven't. So a real sort of military advantage for these imperialist powers based on their industrial power. Also, you get new communications technology, for example, the telegram and telegraph machine. This allows for quick communication between the metropole and the colonies, or between the metropole and military units, which really aids to the level of control that empires can have over their subjects. So all of these sorts of advancements taken together create the means of modern imperialism. It's not coming out of nowhere, though. It's not like all of these tools just developed and woohoo, Europeans were like, now we should imperialize. There was sort of a legacy to these things that had been coming for a while. And we might go back to the 1600s when we see the Dutch and British East India trading companies that we've talked about before. Or we might look at the European colonization of the Americas as sort of foundational moments where these sorts of things were coming together. But one really good example that shows the process is the sort of British rule in India and how the British came to be there. Because you can see a transition from sort of these early imperialistic endeavors that were mostly economic to purely ruling over other people. So by 1707, there was a big problem in South Asia. This really popular Mughal emperor died. And when that happens, the Mughal Empire that we had talked about before, one of those gunpowder empires, so-called, starts to really fall apart. And you get all kinds of different kingdoms breaking up. When that happens, the British are able to play those small groups off of each other. In much the same way that we saw the Portuguese do this a little bit in West Africa after the Songhai Empire falls apart, the British are able to go to new, smaller breakaway provinces for specific economic deals. And they sort of play each group off each other. Who wants to get rich? Who wants to get powerful? Okay, but if all these little states are getting more militarily powerful and they all kind of have beef with each other and they're all competing over the same resources or to get the same British contracts, it could be a real problem. By about 100 years later, the British East India Company owned most of Southeast Asia in one way or another through outright ownership, through contract negotiations, through diplomatic relations that said they could only trade with them, something like this. There's all sort of various forms of this. But it wasn't just like overnight. It's a slow sort of steady build. Then in 1857, there's a problem. Like with all of these sorts of imperialist adventures, there were never that many British people in India, actually. Only a few thousand maybe, especially early on. So the British relied a lot on local police and soldiers to sort of do their work for them. And you just pay these people to enforce your sort of colonial rule. Well, in 1857, there was a new rifle cartridge that came out for these police and soldiers to use. It was a sort of loader where you have the bottom of your rifle and you put a cartridge up in it. And the procedure for doing this was you're holding your rifle in one hand, you take the cartridge in your mouth, you rip this sort of seal off of it so that you can pull it out of the wax paper it's wrapped in, and then you plug it into the bottom of the gun. But people were already sort of dissatisfied with British rule. A rumor began to spread through the military that these new wax coatings and the bullets were greased with animal fat. And in Hindu communities, people heard this rumor that these are greased with cow fat or tallow, right? And so this was pretty offensive to these Indian folks who thought the cow was really important religiously, which was kind of a new idea in India, but that's really tricky. I'll leave that for your South Indian history courses. But this was offensive to them. For the Muslim soldiers, who also constituted a large bulk of the sort of hired police and military forces, a rumor began to circulate with them that it was pig fat that was used on these bullets and in these casings, which they found really offensive, right, for sort of religious reasons as well. So both groups of soldiers refused to use these sorts of things. They were really upset that the British would demand that they put these sorts of things in their mouth or hold them or use them in their jobs. So there was a mutiny amongst these police and military forces that were supposed to be supporting British Empire. When that happened, the British East India Company is in big trouble for a minute. So the British government steps in to directly aid them to put down the rebellion. And afterwards, the British government says, that's it. We can't have an independent country doing we can't have this sort of trading company, this economic unit out there acting like an independent country. The British government should just take it all over and run it as a direct colony, which is exactly what they did starting in 1858. So from then on, India is considered to be a direct colony of Britain, not just some sort of trading nexus where the British had lots and lots of power. It was actually under direct rule of the Europeans. So that's just sort of one example about how these sorts of things develop. It's not like one day they're, all free people or something, and the next day they're colonized. All these forces are coming together and working together. Nationalism, industrialization, these sorts of imperialist ideas, as they're going to spread around the world, primarily originating, out of Europe. Other people are going to want in. If you're a small new country like Belgium, for example, it's pretty small, not necessarily new. You try to get some sort of colonial holding to up your power. Here you can see these different nations carving up China, right? France, Germany, Russia, the United States, cutting up that Chinese pie. Everybody kind of wants a piece of the action, right, if they can get it. And we can see this play out in all kinds of different ways, from the local individual to, state functions. So at the local level, you can see individual people trying to be part of these colonial endeavors. So we might look at European immigration as a great example of how an individual was participating in these systems. So theoretically, this world of industrial capitalism requires mobile labor. Now, we already seen with slavery that that's not always the case. Slaves were moved by people, but didn't actually have freedom to quit their job or anything like that. But let's kind of put a pin in that for now. The idea behind capitalism theoretically is that if you don't like your job, you can quit and you can go somewhere else. We know that's not true. People get locked into wages all the time. But anyway, so as part of the system, there were a lot of push and pull factors for Europeans to get out of Europe and go somewhere else. Lots and lots of them are going to the United States, but they also go to Canada, Australia, South Africa, Chile, Argentina, right? Other places, the Caribbean sometimes, to establish working environments, to serve as lower class labor, to try to start their own farms, all this sort of stuff. So whenever you have migration, there's always kind of two sides. There's something pushing you out of wherever you lived before, and there's something pulling you towards wherever you are going to go. So the factors pushing people out of Europe during this time were pretty heavy. There was a lot of poverty in Europe. There had been a few famines in Europe. There was this idea of prosperity in the future, like if you went somewhere else, maybe you could have some prosperity. There was also a lot easier transportation, right? We saw steam engine and railroads aiding in colonization and imperialism. Here you have the literal people behind that, right? These are the people taking those railroads. Europe had undergone a massive population growth we saw from the Columbian Exchange over the last couple hundred years. All kinds of new food, corn, potatoes, manioc, other stuff had come into the European diet, just produced a lot more calories, hence a lot more people. And Europe had undergone a series of wars and revolutions. Remember the French Revolution kicking off in Europe, then the Napoleonic Wars, then there's all kinds of conflict in Russia and Germany and other stuff. So a lot of Europeans just wanted to get out of there and go somewhere else. So what pulled them to other places? Over here, if you'll see, I called them Neo-Europes. What I mean by Neo-Europes are places like the United States, Canada, South Africa, South America, certain parts like Argentina, Australia. These are places that had relatively similar climates to Europe, where Europeans are going to go and they're going to basically try to recreate the European environment. They're going to try to build European style houses, grow European style food, make European style culture, right? If you go to Australia today, yeah, okay, there's a lot of like local stuff that's totally funky, but most of the people in most areas are going to be white. They're going to speak English. They're going to, if you look at like the plants they plant around their house, right? They're going to put roses there, right? That's straight from England. All these sorts of things. So these sorts of neo-Europes. What was pulling them there? Well, there was this really high expectation that these places were amazing, right? With the gold rush in California, people literally thought there was like gold just laying around the streets. Or with the Irish to New York, they really thought they could get jobs. There was also this sense of progress, right? Remember, we talked about part of the ideas behind the Enlightenment were you could make choices that would make your life steady better and better. So maybe going to a new place, picking up, starting a new job could really increase the benefits coming your way. They could really make your life something. Also, there was just the idea of a new start. John Locke, right, his way of solving the population problem was just move to America. So there were lots of ideas like this that were drawing people to these sort of new white colonies out of Europe. And you see lots and lots of Europeans moving during this time. So during the long 19th century, as many as 55 million Europeans migrated. This graph shows you some of those places they're going from to the United States, for example. So, you see, for example, in Germany, almost 800,000 Germans in 10 years came to the United States. That's just absolutely incredible, right? Followed by 400,000 Irish folks, right? So you see these huge numbers coming out of Europe during this time. It sort of explains a lot of the demographic transition in these places. Here you go. Here's a picture of those boats getting loaded up with people and stuff, right? And here's a graph of where these people are going. So when I said New Europe, or these sort of Neo-Europes, this sort of shows those routes, where that might be. You guys are probably familiar with all of these places to an extent. Algeria might seem a little funny to you, right? Because it's North Africa now and it's its own country. But remember, it was a French colony. And at one point, the majority of people, in some cities at least, would have been white French folks. And they very much saw Algeria almost like an extension of Europe in the Mediterranean. That's changed an awful lot, and we'll kind of get to that later. So all of these folks moving around to those Neo-Europes, it was definitely settler colonialism. And we talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about the unique experience in the Americas, but it's worth kind of mentioning again. Europeans are going to expand into these territories that are already occupied by native peoples. And I have native in like air quotes there because it's a very funny sort of term and all, but don't worry too much about it. And we use Native Americans, right, to talk about the people that were in the United States before Americans were, but in other countries they use all kinds of different terms. So as we talked about before, the whole goal of settler colonialism is to replace what was already there. So this looks very romantic and all, these people moving west, settling new lands, they're pioneers, they're adventurers, they're building America. But what you don't see is that there were already people using that land, there were already people who lived there. And to the largest extent possible, settlers had to remove those people. Typically that was through extreme violence. It could also be done through slow violent methods like forcing people to change their language or forcing people to abandon their sort of cultural norms and things like that. And these ideas were tied to ideas of independence, progress, right, innovation. This was all some of those pull and push factors for why people were migrating, but it really calls into questions the sort of indigenous people's rights to exist. If you're going to settle a new continent, the narrative or a new location, you always have this story that there was nobody there, right? Virginia was named Virginia because it was a virgin territory. There was nobody there. Well, uh-oh, actually, it was already full of people. So what rights did indigenous people have? Who said whether they could exist or not? This is a painting from Australia, right, showing the first sort of interactions between Aboriginal people and the British there. And you can always tell these sorts of paintings were made, of course, by the British. They're fully clothed, they look reasonable. The other people are sort of in a scary majority, they don't have any clothes on, right? They're kind of whipping things around. So you can see the sort of inherent bias in these images, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But what rights did people have? Well, typically, Europeans would say, well, we're so civilized and we're bringing sort of, modernity and progress and innovation to these lands. These other people are so backwards and they're not even using it. So it doesn't really matter. They don't necessarily need rights, which of course is going to set up a big conflict between those two groups. In Asia, you might be a little bit less familiar with some of the stories of immigration and colonization there. But here's a good sort of outline showing during the 19th century what gets colonized by Europeans and how. So let me see, I'll draw on here a little bit, maybe that'll help. All of these sorts of territories, right, get deemed India. Today this is Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma, but that was all sort of the British India. One colony after 1858, like I was saying. Over here you have, oh wait, hold on a second. Over here you have these French colonies, right, of Vietnam. That today is like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. But there's other ones that you might be less familiar with. For example, the Dutch had colonized all of these sorts of areas in what today is Indonesia. The United States had colonized the Philippines. Japan had colonized Korea, which you might not necessarily think about too much, Japan colonizing places, but they were definitely a colonial factor. Russia had colonized down into sort of northern China. So there's a lot of these things going on, and the majority of Asia is going to be sort of divided amongst these different colonial powers. You'll notice China is not shown as being colonized. And that's really tricky. As we talked about with those unequal treaties from last time, China had lost a lot of its sovereignty. It had lost a lot of its control over trade. It had been forced to give up extraterritoriality to different European powers. Individual port cities like Macau and Hong Kong were taken over by Europeans, but there was a Chinese dynasty, and in theory it was an independent empire, but it gets pretty tricky. There was a lot of sort of biting around the edge, taking power from China. You'll also notice that Siam, right in the middle here, is not colonized as well. It's shown as being independent, right? Today that's Thailand, and that's true to an extent that Thailand was never colonized, but it's also partially incorrect. It's a problematic idea. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that kind of later. So most of the main countries in Asia that we have today, right, were colonized as well. In Africa, you see much the same story. There's a particular event in the case of Africa where you see colonization happening really rapidly, and this is a lot later than most people think. A lot of people see sort of European colonization as somehow coming earlier, but actually, as we've discussed before, like with the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans couldn't really get inside Africa all that well. They hadn't explored it fully, they didn't know it was there, they kept dying when they tried to go in there, but all those new inventions were helping them. So here's a map of Africa in 1880. So you can see some of those European colonies just all around the edge. You can see some African empires still, the caliphates, or Egypt, even though it was sort of like a semi-independent section of the Ottoman Empire. Ethiopia is up there independent, right? So you see these different sort of empires and kingdoms still around and a little bit of colonization. But here's that same map in 1885, theoretically, completely colonized by Europe with the exception of Ethiopia. So that's really weird. 5 years on and theoretically all of Africa is colonized. What happened? Well, European powers really wanted to divide up Africa. They wanted those resources. And they'd been having difficulty, and part of that came from the tension between Europeans for who was going to get what. So, great idea. Let's get all the European powers together in Berlin and just roll out a map on the table and just divide up what we want and what we think is fair. And so that's exactly what they did. The leaders of all the European powers got together and they just, on a map, arbitrarily carved out lines of power that they would control. So all those sort of light purple areas become French, all those sort of orangey areas become British, the Germans get those green areas, the Portuguese, the Italian, Spain, everybody gets a little piece. And you'll notice that everything that's left is Ethiopia, it's going to stay independent, and Liberia. But Liberia is pretty tricky. If you know about Liberia, it was actually founded as sort of a joint project by the United States and Britain, where African Americans were sent, and Afro-Canadians to basically to colonize it for themselves. They were sent back to Africa, even though it's, they didn't come from there per se or anything like that. So Liberia is a little tricky. It's independent, but it's run by sort of former transatlantic individuals who had been put there by Europeans. So this is crazy, right? Just when you sort of think about this, like what happens when you just draw all these maps on a line? Like they're like, okay, all of a sudden, this is Belgium, this is British, this is French. These are really arbitrary distinctions. And like we talked about before, when we talked about how maps have power and they're sort of technology, this makes real changes on the ground. Even though these lines didn't represent the people that were there, the communities that were there, the geography that was there, they now divide Africa into different worlds, different little mini worlds. What language is going to be spoken there? Where are those resources going to be sent? Which sort of colonial troops are in charge of those areas? Is all pretty arbitrarily decided and is going to cause a tremendous amount of tension moving forward. So a lot of times the United States is excluded from this discussion. A lot of Americans don't really like to think of the United States as an imperialist power, but it 100% was. We still have several of these colonies. The expansion just across the continent, of course, was a form of imperialism and colonialization. But in terms of overseas imperialism, the United States is a little bit late to the game. So in the early 1800s, we see the Monroe Doctrine, where essentially the US says that the Caribbean belongs to the United States, that they don't want British or French interests acting there economically or militarily, and that really expands to the US seeing Mexico and the Caribbean as their sort of natural places to protect in a very sort of colonial way. By 1898, the US has a fully flung empire. It's a big year for the United States. Basically, in 1898, the Spanish and the United States go to war in Cuba. It's a very tricky, kind of weird thing. Cuba was an island nation breaking away from Spanish rule, and they came to the US Congress for help, and they wanted Americans to defend it. And remember, we've talked about most of the leadership in South America and Latin America and the Caribbean remained Creole. So these leaders from Cuba who came to Congress to talk about their freedom and wanting independence appeared to be very white. They appeared to be upper class. They spoke English very well. And so Congress was like, ooh, yeah, there's these elite, educated, mostly white folks that want American help. We should give it to them. So eventually, the United States and Spain are going to go to war to protect. The U.S. is going to say they're protecting Cuban independence. There's a whole issue of sort of manliness and Roosevelt and all kinds of other stuff. Don't worry about that too much though. So once the war is over, the United States wins really quickly. The Spanish Empire is falling apart by this point, and Americans begin to realize that Cuba, oops, is actually filled with tons of brown and black folks that don't look anything like those Creoles who came to Congress, and it's very confusing. All of a sudden, Congress changes its mind. Cuba does get independence, however, the United States demands that we get to write the Cuban Constitution, and we put a clause into it that says we can intervene in Cuban politics for any reason forever. So if you wonder why Cubans didn't like us at some point, that's it. Anywho, along with Cuba, at the end of the war, the United States gets a bunch of other Spanish territories kind of fall in its lap, like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And all of a sudden, the United States is an empire. We colonize these places sort of by default. A lot of the fighting for the Spanish-American War actually happens in the Philippines around Manila, which is a big city in the main harbor there. And once the war's over, a lot of American warships are still there. The Filipinos were already in their own sort of struggle for independence, and the United States said, no, you can't have it. We won you, essentially, from the Spanish. But it's not just those places. Hawaii also becomes much more of an American colony in 1898. The sort of monarchy is forced by white sugar plantation owners to sign away Hawaii's rights and dissolve the government. So lots of places come to the United States in 1898. And then in the years immediately afterwards, America begins to expand even more across the Pacific to places like Samoa. We start to intervene in politics in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, Honduras, all over the place, sort of culminating in the U.S. Owning a large section of Panama in 1914. Again, this is pretty tricky. There was a sort of small breakaway movement in Panama that the U.S. helped to fund, sort of illegally, to cause problems within this newly forming sort of Colombian Panamanian government, on the pretext that afterwards we would get the rights to continue to make a canal across Panama, which the French had tried to do before. Anywho, after all that, the U.S. owns the Panama Canal and several miles on both sides until 1999. So, pretty serious stuff. And people at the time were really conflicted about this. Some Americans thought it was a bad idea to get into the imperialist business. Other Americans loved it. Strangely, it was a little bit opposite to now. People on the left at this time, people who were more liberal, were tended to be pro-imperialism. People on the right, people more conservative, tended to oppose imperialism. And this is sort of opposite to now. People on the left tend to be really anti-imperialist, and people on the right tend to be a little bit more okay with the US flexing its power abroad. But the reason that it was different was, at this time, liberals were really excited about the idea that the United States could improve these places. Right, that story of uplift, that story of progress. Conservatives at this time didn't want these places to be part of the United States, because what would happen if these Filipinos all became citizens, for example? How much would it cost the government? Although colonialism is not a cost, it's a benefit to governments, that you have colonies to extract the resources. But the argument from the right at this time was, look, what if somehow the Philippines all become citizens and they can vote, for example? You're going to have all these brown people voting? I don't think so. So that's where there's sort of this tension comes from. And you have this political cartoon. Here's Uncle Sam in school, right? That's Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii up front that he's teaching. And then in the back, you have places like New Mexico and Arizona. So this sort of shows how this political cartoonist was thinking about like newly added American territories were like a little bit older and a little bit more American. And then you had these new territories where the kids are darker and less well behaved and stuff like this. In the back, you have the Chinese that have been excluded. You have a Native American who's got his book upside down. You got a black kid cleaning the windows. Right, so it sort of shows all the racist tropes going on in the U.S. at this time in a sort of critical way, right? This is an argument maybe against the sort of mainstream imperialist narrative that we could go to these places and like fix them and stuff like this, or it's at least doing some kind of ironic, political statement about that. But the U.S. was definitely part of this imperial process. So these European and American imperialist powers basically conquer um, Africa, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. There were remnants of it already in Latin America, right? Hence the name. But there are a few alternative examples that show the sort of limits or show some resistance to this process, and they're pretty important for thinking about what's going to happen later. So one sort of counterexample is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia remained a free kingdom or empire throughout this period, throughout the scramble for Africa. It was supposed to go to Italy. Italy sought to colonize it. And in 1896, the Italians invaded with the help of some of their other colonies and tried to force Ethiopia to become an Italian colony. It didn't work because Ethiopians had already embraced certain aspects of the modern world, such as firearm technology. So the Italian troops showed up, and to their surprise, there were a lot of Ethiopians ready to fight that brought more modern-looking rifles, more modern-looking cannons, and they were able to resist the Italians. When they did this, it was a huge embarrassment for Italy, and a sort of strange feeling reverberated through Europe and through the United States. Here you had a black African nation resisting European aggression, and it's the only one that was able to do this. So it sort of troubled that narrative that Europeans were better or they deserved to do these sorts of things. So people started to make a lot of excuses for this. Well, they said, well, the Ethiopians are Christian, for example, so because they're Christian, maybe they're more modern, maybe that's why. Also, a lot of Italians begin to propagate this narrative that Ethiopians are not black. And this turned out okay for some elites in Ethiopia as well. And the narrative became, well, these people are actually Semitic, they're actually closer to Jewish folks, okay, and then they spend all this time down there in that hot, hot sun and they get dark. Well, this is just some racist reasoning that was used to try to explain how this white power could have lost to an African kingdom. And we're going to see more stuff like this. This ties into a sort of racist explanation for imperialism that we're going to see more of. Here's a zoom in on that painting about the war, and you can see these Ethiopian soldiers using what looks to be a revolver, and these Italians surrendering to them. This was really big news kind of around the world when this happened. They were using modern cannons, and here on the right was the Emperor of Ethiopia at the time, Menelik II. What you'll notice is he's wearing this hat that looks pretty cool. It's not Ethiopian, it's an Italian hat. So even though the Ethiopians defended themselves from Italy, they still were modernizing. They were still embracing certain aspects of European culture that they thought were cool and bringing that on board. It's not like they were rejecting the West. They adopted technology, firearms, clothing, other stuff like this. They were participating in the modern world. They obviously just didn't want to be a colony and were able at that point to defend themselves. And they're going to play a big role later during decolonization, as we'll see as well. Another sort of counterexample to this whole narrative of Europeans and Americans taking over the world comes from Japan. So last time we watched that video on the Meiji Restoration, and part of that was their taking over of other places. So after 1868, Japan is, hell-bent on modernizing and industrializing, even at the sake of their own people, all kinds of stuff. And this leads them to solidify the state, to take over their neighbors. So places like Hokkaido and Ryukyu, which were kingdoms to the north and south, or at least unexplored areas to the north for a lot of the Japanese, come to fall into the sort of Japanese nation state, even though there's other people there like the Ainu in the north, or people who we call like Okinawans in the south, become part of Japan. They get folded into the nation. Then in the 1880s, Japan is going to imitate exactly what happened to it with Matthew Perry and all that stuff you watched last time. And they're going to start sending gunboats to Korea, to China. They're going to get involved with the war in China. And they beat up on China severely. And when they do, China cedes to them Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula. And we already talked a little bit about China doing all these unequal treaties. This is part of that process, right? And China losing sections of territory and kind of being colonized, kind of not. Only a few years later, in 1904, Japan is going to go to war with Russia, as we already saw as well. And they're going to whoop up on Russia too. This is another sort of major fundamental challenge to the sort of imperialist world order. Here you have a non-white, non-Christian Asian country beating up on one of the oldest, imperial powers in Europe, even though Russia was in the middle of a revolution and all kinds of other problems. It sent the sort of shockwave through Europe that there were these other people out there with strange race, strange religion, that were able to beat white Christians sort of at their own game. And this was really disturbing for a lot of Europeans. The sort of intersection of race and imperialism was critical to their explanation for why Europe was on top or how they were superior. And Japan really challenged that. This is true. So this is the first war with China, right? The Sino-Japanese War, showing the Japanese gunboat imperialism sort of up there in Korea. The Liaodong Peninsula they're going to get, and then down at the bottom where it's in yellow, Taiwan. This is sort of showing that Russo-Japanese War. By this point, the Japanese were heavily engaged in economic imperialism in Korea and become openly engaged in war with Russia. And that area, Manchuria, is going to get ceded to Japan eventually, leading into World War II, which we'll talk more about kind of in the future. But you can see Japan depicting all of these events as them becoming a modern sort of world power, just like the Europeans. So here you have the Japanese, they're all in sort of modern military uniforms at the time. The Chinese are still wearing Chinese military uniforms. They've been beaten. They're on a modern looking gunship there, right, that they've been successful, they've won. The Japanese at this point were thinking that in order to be part of the sort of global elite, to prove they were a strong country, they had to be imperialist, because when they were meeting British folks or Americans or Germans, they all had empires, and they depicted that not only as something they deserved because they were advanced, but part of what made them advanced. So attacking others and getting colonies was seen as part of being a modern country, and Japan wanted in just like everybody else. Here's a Japanese depiction of the Russo-Japanese War. So you have this one Japanese guy with his rifle. I don't know, maybe he's run out of bullets. He has to use it as like a club, taking on like 3 Russians at once. Maybe not super duper accurate, but it gives a sense of the growing sort of feeling of Japanese, this like extreme martial prowess, their ability to beat up on China, to beat up on Russia. And we're going to see this is going to lead towards somewhere. This is going to be part of thinking coming down the line when we get towards World War I, World War II. So keep an eye on that. So all of this stuff kind of going together, all of these imperial practices, is going to create a new sort of global system. You get a worldwide sort of transformation of how everyone's connected and what it means to be in power. And this leads to a lot a sort of globalization, a sort of meeting of the minds, a sort of mixing of cultures in ways that simply weren't possible or desirable before. And a lot of it's kind of unexpected. So the first thing you might want to look at is how these different empires ruled. What was the sort of types of imperial rule? Because there's a wide variety to it. You might look at direct rule, for example, where an area was just colonized directly. So, for example, when the British colonized the 13 colonies, that's an example of direct rule. You just send people out there, and it's like a new extension of the home. Indirect rule works a little bit differently. So, for example, for much of the British colonization of India, it was by the East India Company. And even though the British government wasn't necessarily controlling everything, British people were in charge of the economy, the sort of police, the military. They weren't like running the country per se. It wasn't necessarily done by the British per se, but British people were the ones exploiting everything, were the ones sort of in control of everything behind the scenes. You might keep a local king, but he might be beholden to you, things like that. You can talk about settler colonialism. For example, the French in Algeria, like I already said, that hundreds of thousands of French people moved to this place in North Africa that they saw as an extension of France, just another place you might move. Not much different than the other aspects of the French kingdom, right? Just happen to be on the other side of the Mediterranean. You might look at puppet states. We're going to see more of these coming up where theoretically there's like an independent nation state, but really it's run by another country and altogether. But all of these different forms of rule have a lot of stuff in common. One of the things they all have in common is you need lots and lots of collaborators. So after 1945, after 1950, as all of these places struggle to gain independence, you're going to get the sense that they never wanted anything to do with the British, the French, the Americans, whatever. But when you actually look at the details on the ground, for example, like the French in Vietnam, there were never that many French people there. So how did they make the system work? Well, they had a lot of help from local people. The idea of divide and conquer, right? You play different groups off each other. Or the British in India, right? They made the caste system even more official, and they tried to encourage one caste to see themselves as better than the others and to work with them exclusively, all these sorts of things. So there's a sort of collaboration required. If local people never participated in any way, imperialism and colonization wouldn't work. You need the help of lots of local people to do it. But that's not a very savory story, because in the end, all those people come to be seen as traitors or fighting against the country or somehow like poisoning their brothers and sisters. But if you think about it, these places weren't nation states yet. They had been ruled under various empires. And also, most of them would have been simply trying to stay out of trouble, would have been trying to feed their families, would have been trying to get a job, all that sort of thing. So collaboration is a really tricky topic, but it's definitely required for empires to work. You might also look at the sort of benefits of empire economically and the sort of movements of people and why they were doing these things. So we already said, 50 million Europeans migrated out of Europe, lots of them to the United States, but other places as well. There was a big shuffling around of human beings during this time, much, much more than during the transatlantic slavery, right? We looked at, 12 million slaves were put in the Caribbean or Brazil or the United States, which is incredibly high. But in a shorter period, 50 million Europeans left Europe. Of course, it was voluntary and completely different in terms of the sort of ethics and morals of it and that sort of thing. But just in terms of the scope of it, it radically changed who lived where around the world. During the same time, about 3 million Indians were resettled by the British. These were indentured laborers. So India had lots and lots of people. The British had fought to end slavery when it was no longer lucrative for them, and they still needed, lots of laborers to work around the world for them, though, as part of their empire. So they took, people from South Asia, took them to the Pacific, took them to the Caribbean. They took Chinese to Louisiana. They moved people all around and used them as a form of labor. Other people were moving more freely. For example, in the United States and Australia, there were pretty big influxes of Chinese populations. So when you think about the gold rush in the United States, if you watch like an old-timey West movie, there's always like one Chinese person or something. To an extent, that's true. A lot of Chinese in southern China had worked in mining industries. And when the sort of gold rush happened in the United States and California, or in Australia as well, there was a similar gold rush. Chinese folks went there to escape the sort of overpopulation of southern China and to put their skills to the test, And at the time when the gold rush happened, California was not totally incorporated into the United States yet. Lots of people came to California later and were surprised to find that Asians and Latinos and other people had already come there. So, yeah, it was kind of early immigration to these areas. Later, we see a lot of immigration from Japan to the United States, but also to Mexico and Peru and other places. Again, they're sort of escaping sort of overgrowing population mixed with the sort of industrial stuff we saw from the Meiji Restoration. And there was this idea that Japanese could be like pioneers to resettle around the world as well. We're going to see more from the Japanese Americans coming up, particularly during World War II. We see big exchanges of Mexicans in and out of the southern United States. Remember, places like California, Arizona, New Mexico had all been part of the Mexican Empire before they were taken from Mexico by the United States. So there had been Mexican people that lived in those regions. That kind of created long-term connections. Also, southern states, once they were fixed, didn't have enough labor, and the United States asked Mexicans to come in to work for them when the economy was good, and then when the economy gets bad, they pretend that Mexicans are taking all their jobs and they kick them out. And this is a repeating process that continues to go on today. But all of these economies were based on extraction, and to do that extracting, you simply need more labor. That's one of the reasons you see these massive movements of people, right? So we could focus in on the Indian and Chinese contract workers a little bit, because I think you're more familiar probably with some of the other groups. This is a really weird case. It's not quite slavery. It's something different entirely. But in this sort of long 19th century, as many as 12 million Asians migrate for work. It's sort of voluntary. The British are going to arrange for these Indians to move throughout empire overall. So you get large pockets of Indians, for example, in South Africa, or in some Pacific islands, like Fiji, working as agricultural laborers. Just like in the case of slavery, primarily the British are looking for men and boys because they're seen as being more productive in their labor, and they're going to serve kind of all over. And when you look at the sort of process the British were using, it does remind you of slavery a little bit. People were categorized by numbers, they were given contracts they couldn't read, all these sorts of things, and taken around the world. The same was true with Chinese, particularly out of Hong Kong and Macau and places like this, southern China. But once these people are taken to, let's say, South Africa, they have a contract to work. It's kind of an indentured servitude. But these are not the arrangements that British folks made for themselves in the 13 colonies or something. These contracts are basically impossible to ever pay off or to ever buy passage home. So a lot of these trips are one way and change the demographics of the region significantly. So if you go to South Africa today, a lot of food is really heavily influenced by South Asia. and that's where that comes from. Or most Caribbean countries have some sort of Indian food left over, like roti or something, right? Comes from South Asia. And a lot of the Caribbean countries have this sort of like some sort of flatbread or something like that as well. So there is a lot of changes that come with this, but it's a very weird system. The book does a pretty good job talking about it. It's not slavery, it's not voluntary, it's kind of somewhere in between. In the Americas, you see a different system. The Chinese that come to the Americas and then the Japanese that come to the Americas are primarily free labor. They're not forced to do it. They might be fleeing poverty or overpopulation, but they're making choices about where to go, and some of them are very, very successful, and they remain independent citizens to a certain extent. So by 1848, you have Chinese immigrating to California. About 2 decades later, you start to get Japanese immigrants to California, places like Gold Hill, California, unsurprisingly. And they really do start to come in large numbers. So by 1880, for example, you have more than 100,000 people of Chinese descent in the US. Many of them would be second generation, right? So you have people that are Chinese but were born in California or Washington. So this is really tricky. Are these people going to be American? Are they going to be citizens? What's happening? The same thing starts to be a problem with the Japanese. So primarily they're going to get jobs in the railroads and mines or in sort of ethnic enclaves. White business owners and white communities tend to refuse to hire them for racist reasons. They don't want to hire the Chinese. They see them as a sort of racial threat on the West Coast for sure. So you start to get Chinatowns where people kind of cook for themselves, clean for themselves, rent out property to each other because they can't necessarily in the sort of white world for the rest of the state that's developing. And there's a lot of sort of racial tensions that come with this. So if you look at this and you're like, oh, where is this? Well, San Francisco, right? So the early development of San Francisco contained Chinese folks and Japanese folks, just like white Americans. But these people were never really considered 100% Americans by the government, by the local government, by the federal government, or by the white folks that lived there. And in fact, they were seen as a sort of threat to American existence. So here's a political cartoon, the great fear of the period. That's Uncle Sam being eaten. On one side, he's being eaten by the Irish. On the other side, he's being eaten by the Chinese. The problem eventually gets solved when the Chinese just eat everybody. So the sort of racist imagination at the time was that the Chinese were coming too fast. They were simply going to outbreed white Americans, and that the West Coast would at some point just be filled with Chinese, and then eventually the Chinese would just take over. This idea of yellow peril, as it sort of came to be called, was incredibly popular. There was a book written at the time about how the Chinese simply could breed faster and how they could live on less food and all these sorts of things, and how it was inevitable that the Asians would sort of take over the world. And the President Roosevelt was actually very moved by this and was very concerned about these sorts of things as well. So there was a big sort of debate about economic rights for these people, citizen rights for these people. And we'll kind of see later where that stuff is going to go. All of this ties into imperialism in a unique way, because these developments are all happening in a world where race is starting to form as an idea. So modern racism, the racism that you know about or you've experienced, is a pretty new phenomenon in terms of world history. So around the 1840s, racism starts to develop in this sort of scientific way, right? The writings of biologists and people working on anatomy, scientists trying to prove European superiority or prove the accuracy of the Bible, all these sorts of things are coming together, and they're starting to make a sort of racial explanation for why the world is the way it is, and they depict it in scientific terms. So this is when you start to get things like measuring the skulls of black folks and white folks and proving that the skulls of white folks can fit in more marbles. Well, as it turns out, those tests were all bogus. Those have been recreated, and it just turned out the people who were doing them, like, could carefully stack the marbles in the white skull to show that more would fit or something like that. These ideas start to couple with Darwinism, that idea of, racial and genetic advancement. Darwin didn't believe these sorts of things, but his work was utilized and sort of repurposed to show this idea, this concept of survival of the fittest. So people began to talk about racial degeneration or racial growth, and races had to be ever advancing, and this turns into a sort of popular racism where people see their race in a certain way. And in particular, this is all coming out of Europe and the United States. So it's this idea that white folks are superior. And at first, it's not just white folks, it's Anglo folks, so like specifically British and American, as like the top of this sort of racial hierarchy, and then kind of the rest of Europeans, and then kind of brown people, and then black folks as you go down. You start to get ideas about racial purity. You start to get ideas. This is all, of course, tied to nationalism. And it's really tricky because people see it as like cutting edge science. Of course, it's not scientific at all. It's total garbage. But whenever you take a scientific idea that's kind of hard to understand and simplify it for popular consumption, things go wrong. Think about the way the universe works. Well, my level of understanding of that is minuscule compared to like an astrophysicist. So yeah, people can tell me about a black hole or something and I can be like, oh, okay, cool. I know a little bit about it. It's like this much. If I try to make like broad, statements about the world based on that little bit of knowledge about black holes or something, it's kind of ridiculous. But nevertheless, that happens all the time. During pandemics, right? People with no real scientific knowledge make, statements about viruses and how viruses work all the time, etc. So these ideas become really popularized, and they're used as a sort of support for imperialism. Why do we have to imperialize other people? Well, we're racially superior. We're taking that superiority to the world. If we're settler colonialists, we're creating a world with more white people, and so it's better, right? If we're, indirectly just extracting resources from another country or something, we can say, well, but we're bringing them Christianity, we're bringing them railroads, we're civilizing those people, we're uplifting them, over time, of course. The time never comes, but that's the sort of idea. And these ideas are self-replicating. So they provide both the sort of proof for the racist logic and the sort of reason for it. So you say, okay, well, we're going to imperialize, we're going to, go and colonize this country because of our racial superiority. We have firearms, so we can do that. So when we do take over the country, it proves that we're superior because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to take it over, right? So it kind of builds on itself. This is not to say that everybody bought into these ideas. There's tons of examples of resistance to it, particularly from the colonial world. And your book does a pretty good job pointing out some of these. So you might look at like Ram Mohan Murray, or you might look at King Chulalongkorn, which is from India and Thailand, respectively. And these were early writers who, Roy is a sort of thinker and political activist and writer who challenges the system of British imperialism by questioning the whole system of superiority, modernization, and starts to recast a lot of that. King Chulalongkorn is from Thailand. He is a sort of modernizer. He ends slavery officially in Thailand right around the same time as the American Civil War, and the Thais are very proud that they did that on their own rather than having to fight a war over it or have it forced upon them. And he sees the West as having all kinds of great stuff, particularly technology, and argues that Thailand should use these things. Thailand should become Western in some ways, but keep their religion, keep their culture. It's okay to have the clothes, it's okay to have the technology, sure, but you really want to be your own nation, right? So there's resistance, there's debates within these sorts of things right from the beginning. So through all of these sorts of examples and thinking about where empire came from, where the sort of imperialism developed from, where it's going, we see these global empires really increasing in sort of speed, integrating the whole globe, right? Like in theory, Africa gets colonized, the whole continent, within 5 or 10 years, just based on putting lines on the map and then enforcing them. This really allows Europeans and Americans, the Japanese, to jump ahead of their neighbors and sort of outpace them, outproduce them, briefly anyway, in terms of industrial development, control, but also in terms of their ideology, finding themselves to be superior to the people next to them. Had, everyone in Kenya modern guns, would they have been able to defeat the British? Yeah, of course. They didn't have them. So, but when the British do get Kenya as a colony, that's not how they depict it. Of course, they're going to depict it as being superior some way or another. So all of these sorts of things are happening. This idea of white superiority is forming, European superiority, Christian superiority, at the expense of these other places. These other places are also being drawn into a globalized world really quickly. And they do get railroads, steam power, new forms of agriculture, global exposure, but it's at a tremendous cost. It's not for their benefit. Some benefit slips through the cracks to them, but that's what can't be collected by the imperial powers. We're going to see this come to a head in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, where all of these places that are being colonized that we just talked about are going to realize that maybe there's other systems, maybe there's another world they want to envision. But we'll wait for that a little bit. Next time, we're going to talk about the beginning of the Great War, World War I. It wasn't called that at first, right? Because we didn't really know there was going to be a second one. So get reading in the Traditions and Encounters. As always, let me know what questions you have. Talk to you next time.